Let us illuminate our hearts. Bless me, Lord, as I speak. We ask all this through Christ our Lord. Amen. Father and Son. Welcome. Coming in. A little bit of recap. Thank you for joining us a week off. I'm rested and recovered. I was fine, but I could have easily given the talk, but I was a little skeptical that some people might say, "Oh, Brother Anthony's sick. We don't want to get sick. We don't want to go." So I thought, "Oh, if I give everybody a week off, then nobody has an excuse for not coming tonight." So we'll pick up where we left off and then finish next week, Holy Week. Okay. So first, though, a little bit of recap, just to remember where we've come and how everything fits together. As you know, that's something that I always try to emphasize, is that we're not just covering things kind of willy-nilly, but really building a picture. So how many of you were here for the first week of this series? Most of you. Yeah, good. Okay. So we talked about, the title of the discussion was The Law of Liberty. And we talked about what is real freedom and what is a kind of false freedom. Anybody remember that discussion, or what stood out to you about that? What was the contrast? What are we talking about? What is real freedom?
Pure.
What's that?
In its kind of purest form.
Yes. Okay. So following the divine law, following the natural law. See, because following the natural law, which is, if you remember, the natural law is the law. The eternal law is the law that governs reality. The natural law is then that law as it is imprinted in our minds by God. So basically following the natural law means is living in accord with reason. Okay? So we don't do things arbitrarily. We do things then according to our own nature. So then that took us kind of back to really the first series that we did in October. How many of you were here in the October series? Less of you, but it's okay, some of you. But, we talked about... What's that?
We came back.
Yeah. What we kept coming back to in that series, and he's made several appearances here during this series as well, is the little toaster, right? The toaster has its own particular kind of nature, right? So the toaster is going to be happy when he acts like a toaster. If the toaster tries to be a vacuum cleaner, it's not good for anybody, right? Okay, so flourishing, being happy, is about fulfilling one's own interior, intrinsic purpose, your nature. So that's the natural law. And so freedom is when we are able to move in accord with nature, with reason, doing things as we ought to do them. So what is then a false freedom is this kind of arbitrary freedom of like, well, I can do what I want, even if it's not the way I was made or the way I was designed. So again, if the toaster wants to say, well, I can be a vacuum cleaner if I want to be, well, yes and no, but that's not really an expression of his freedom. So we talked about that with the reason why Scripture can call the Ten Commandments the law of liberty is because it's showing us how to live actually free. Because the Lord says, whoever sins is a slave to sin. So there really is a contradiction between our freedom and sin. When we do things in contradiction to our nature, we're not really acting freely. We're being enslaved by maybe our lower passions or something like that. Okay, so that's a little recap about freedom, where we started. Then we looked at, in the second week, questions of justice. So do we remember what is justice? What's a good definition for justice? Justice is about giving to each one what is their due, right? So that what is due to them is their right. Remember, that word jus in Latin is the right. So rights are things that we owe to each other. So if I do $20 worth of labor for you, I now have a right to $20 in compensation. It's a commutation, it's an exchange. So we have rights and responsibilities towards each other And those relationships are governed by what we call justice. Okay? So in the 10 Commandments, the first 3 commandments are about our relationship of justice towards God. So who remembers the 10 Commandments? The first commandment is what? Right, you shall have no other gods before me. The second commandment is... No, the V, not the... Don't take the Lord's name in vain. Okay. The third commandment, keep holy the Lord's day. The fourth commandment, honor your father and mother. The fifth commandment, don't kill. The sixth commandment, don't commit adultery. Yeah. The seventh commandment, don't steal. The eighth commandment, don't bear false witness. Yeah. The ninth commandment, everybody remember this one? Covet your neighbor's wife. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. This is you, this is your neighbor, this is your neighbor's wife. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. And then the 10th commandment, don't covet your neighbor's goods. Very good. So, those are our... Oh, there we go. Okay. Those are our 10 commandments. So here in the first 3, remember we talked about we honor God in 3 ways. The justice due to God is in thought, word, and deed. You see that, right? Thought, word, and deed. Now, so this is our obligation towards God. This is the first commandment. The first tablet. Remember that Moses received the 10 commandments in 2 tablets. The first is our relationship towards God in thought, word, and deed. Now you'll notice over here, this concerns the relationship to our neighbor, but notice how it's in the reverse order. 9 and 10 are about in your thoughts. Don't covet. The 8th commandment is in your words, and these are in deeds. Okay? So we have thought, word, deed, words, thought. Okay? God and neighbor. So there's nothing arbitrary. Everything here really makes sense, the order that it's in. Okay. So what is justice? We reviewed this. These are some of our quotes, giving to each one what is their due. And then we give those things to God. So remember these different types of justice. Commutative justice is like in an exchange, buying and selling things, that there should be equality in what is bought, what is sold, the price that is given. Those things should be equal. That's commutative justice. General justice is what we owe to the community as a whole. But what is owed to the community as a whole is often represented by the leaders of the community because they're responsible for taking care of the whole. So we owe a certain amount of, again, fidelity, honor, reverence, and so forth to the leader of the community, that is to the community as a whole. But in turn, the community as a whole owes something to the individual. So we call this distributive justice, the distribution of goods, of each receiving what they deserve, and general justice, the justice that what we owe to the leader. This is all review. Everybody more or less feeling good? Okay, good. So a man owes 3 things to the head of the community: fidelity, reverence, service. Now, those then are the first 3 commandments, which we reviewed before. But this then extends and flows over into the 4th commandment, which is our relationship to our parents. And here's what Thomas Aquinas has to say as we make this transition from the first table to the second table. Aquinas says, to his neighbors as well, a person must behave himself, in particular as to those to whom he is indebted by paying his debts. And in this sense is to be taken the commandments about honoring one's parents. So for the first 3 commandments, it's about what we owe to God by virtue of the fact that he is God. Okay, so that's a relationship of justice because something is owed to God. But now Thomas is saying, well, in the same way, by analogy, by extension, we also then owe things to other people. And first and foremost, who do we owe something to but to our own parents? Right? So he continues, just as God is the universal principle of being in respect of all things, so is a father a principle of being in respect of his son. Therefore, the precept regarding parents was fittingly placed after the precepts regarding God. Right? Does that make sense? So we owe something to God because he is our creator. Well, then in the same way, we owe something to our parents because, again, they cooperate with God in our very being. So if we owe something to anyone, right, we owe something to our parents automatically. So everyone has this debt of honor to one's parents because in other sorts of relationships of justice, for instance, I gave the example of if I do some yard work for you, you might owe me some compensation. But that's only if I do the work, right? So you don't naturally owe me anything in particular, but we might enter into a relationship in which now we owe each other something because of particular circumstances, because of an agreement. But with parents and children, it's not like that. They don't first exist and then later they come into some kind of mutual agreement. I mean, just by virtue of existing, there is a relationship of indebtedness that exists within the family itself, right? Does that make sense? Okay. So with that, Aquinas continues, it is not an immediate dictate of natural reason that a man should do one thing in return for another, unless he happened to be indebted to someone. That's what we're saying, right? You don't just naturally owe something in particular to anyone. Now, a child's debt to his parent is so evident that one cannot get away from it by denying it, since the parent is the principle of generation and being, and also of upbringing and teaching. Okay? So those are the natural rights of parents and children, right? Children naturally owe their parents honor and respect, obedience, because of what the parents then in turn owe the children, which is upbringing and teaching, right? So the parents are naturally indebted to the child to protect them, to raise them, to teach them. Okay, so there's a mutual indebtedness that is built into nature, right? So the way that we can map this in terms of these different types of justice, again, this can apply obviously in our relationship with God or in the relationship to the social authority, something like that. But on a smaller scale, the same thing applies within a family, right? What is owed to the parents by the children, we would call a general justice, right? So there's something that they owe to the parents because the parents are responsible for the good of the whole. Okay. Now they also owe a certain kind of justice to each other because siblings, for instance, because they are equals in a sense, then they owe each other a justice that is more like commutative justice, a justice of equality. They're peers. Now, you might have cases with age difference and so forth where a certain sibling has maybe certain privileges over another, but in general, there's a relationship of equality here. But then the parents also owe something to the children, right? And this downward debt is what we call distributive justice. Now, Aquinas has this to say. In distributive justice, which again is this, right, what the parents owe to the children, in distributive justice, equality is observed according to geometrical proportion, whereas in commutative justice, which is this justice here, it follows arithmetical proportion. Anybody have any idea what that means? So, basically what he's saying is that geometrical proportion would be something like this. Think about the relationship between shapes, right? Geometry. So if you have a square that's 2 by 2 and you double it, well, now you have a square that's 4 by 4, right? Whereas if you start with a square that's 8 by 8 and you double it, well, now it's 16 by 16. So in this case, both of these squares have been doubled, but the amount by which they grew is vastly different because the amount that they started with is different. So what's Aquinas getting at here? But the distributive justice, that is the justice that is owed by the leaders to the individual members, it is not necessary that each, let's say within the context of the family, that each individual child is treated exactly the same way. The parents don't owe the same exact thing to every child because the needs and the abilities of each child might be different. So, for instance, if you have a child that has particular needs and is falling behind, then you might give to that child more help and more tutoring so that they can continue to thrive. So you're not treating them the same. But on the other side, you also might have a child that has particular natural gifts and abilities. And so you might give that child more of an opportunity in developing those than you would to another child, right? So parents treating their children is not about treating each child the same, but about treating them fairly in a kind of proportion, what Aquinas is calling a geometrical proportion. Okay? Whereas in commutative justice, which again is justice between equals, like if we're buying and selling something, then that is an arithmetical proportion, meaning that there needs to be an equality, a numerical equality, right? So if we're exchanging grain and wine and beef and whatever, right? There needs to be, whatever I give you needs to be equivalent to what you give me, so that when we walk away, none of us has gained an advantage over the other, because then that would be an unfair exchange. But distributive justice is not about exchanges. It's about each person then getting what is owed to them, but in their own particular way. And that's the responsibility of the leader, in this case the parents, to make those types of decisions. Does that make sense?
So two siblings measuring hope. You're right down there with the...
Yeah, exactly. So the siblings relate in this more kind of commutative way, right? Where their exchanges are equal because they're not the head of the family to make those sort of decisions of, well, actually, I deserve more. That's more the parents' decision to make of who deserves what in a given context, right? Okay. So there is justice within the family, and this is the way that we can see this. And again, so these structures that apply to God's relationship to the world is governed by that kind of justice. Parents and their relationships with children is that kind of justice. But then on lots of other scales, you can think about the same principles applying. So within an organization like a church, okay, you have the pastor who he has responsibility of care for the whole, okay? So he may not treat each parishioner the same, but ideally he would treat every parishioner fairly, with justice, giving to each one what is needed, right? And then in return, we owe something to the pastor. We owe something to the leader because he takes care of the whole. So we are actually serving, by serving the leader, we are also serving the community as a whole, right? Because he has care of the whole. So that applies to the church, that applies to governments on big levels, on small levels. These principles of justice apply across the board to any types of community. So whether it's something as big as God and the world, or as small as a parent and their children, it's justice that is governing all these relationships of what is owed, and the different ways that we can kind of calculate that relationship of rights. Okay? Any questions about justice, family justice?
One question.
Yes, please.
Why did Aquinas go back to the Ten Commandments and the laws? Why didn't he just build from... Because Jesus had already done that, right?
Uh-huh.
So he kind of turned laws into principles. Why did he go from Jesus? And kind of explain that. So Jesus, for example, would have said, in treating your children, he wouldn't have gone back to the first Ten Commandments and said, respect your parents, and your parents owe the children. But then you don't have to treat them all equally. Jesus would have said, just use the principle of love, right?
Yeah. Well, so the question is, why is Aquinas looking at the Ten Commandments specifically and not just the teachings of Jesus, which seem to be simpler, more kind of the basic principles, especially of love, right?
It's actually more complicated.
Sure.
But it's more effective because principles work in all situations.
Yeah.
And if you're experienced and you have principles, then you can make better judgments.
Yeah.
Laws are, in a way, not really good for understanding reality. Right?
Yeah. Well, so...
I mean, even the Ten Commandments, they're really, you call them absolutes, but they're not really absolutes, right? Only semantically they're absolutes. Because you're saying that, for example, murder, you're saying, you shall not murder.
Yeah.
What does murder mean? It means illegal killing, right?
Sure, yeah.
So you're saying, the law says you cannot kill illegally. And you can apply that to all the Ten Commandments. It's not really a good way of understanding and applying it to the real world. And that's why Jesus then starts speaking about principles.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think...
why did Thomas Aquinas not talk more about Jesus? Why did he talk about Ten Commandments?
Well, I mean, so this is a section in which he's trying to give an overview of human morality, particular in his section on justice, okay? So he talks about, if you remember our discussion in October, we talked about all the different virtues. So virtues are really where human morality is rooted in habits of action. So after he talks about law, then he talks about grace, which is what actually empowers us to do this. So, I mean, Thomas's system is a huge system, and we're focusing in on a very tiny little piece of it. Now, there's a lot of depth there, but it's a very small part of Thomas's bigger picture. But why do we look at the law, the Ten Commandments in particular? Well, because Jesus himself continues to refer back to this, okay? So, for instance, when the rich young ruler comes to him and says, "What must I do to have eternal life?" He says, "Keep the commandments," right? And so he's referring back to the Decalogue, which remains, as we said before, in terms of its moral teaching, it is an unchanging teaching, okay? And so as we can see, these are not arbitrary, but a very helpful way of cataloging what are our responsibilities. Now, again, as Aquinas said, and as we said from the beginning, it's not as if we necessarily needed God to articulate all these things. Part of what Aquinas is trying to show is that all of these things are naturally knowable to anyone who considers it rightly. But it's just taking the opportunity to pause and to see what are the underlying roots, the rationale behind why human morality is structured in this way. Okay, so moving forward then, if we owe this kind of respect, again, to parents, Aquinas can say that this can be expanded, that the principle of the fourth commandment can apply more generally as well. So to the fourth commandment, prescribing the honor due to parents, is added the precept about honoring the aged, and likewise all the precepts prescribing the reverence to be observed towards our betters, or kindliness towards our equals or inferiors. So the principle of the fourth commandment, Aquinas is saying that if you look at what is the core of it, it concerns our obligations in these relationships of justice generally within the community, okay? That we are taking care of the common good, giving reverence to our superiors, whether that be in an ecclesial context, a political context, or a family context. That the principle applies across the board. So if we have this kind of relationship, how do we treat our fellow person? We have to, again, remember, as now we move forward, we have to remember this principle of nature. That in order to do good for someone else, which is what morality is concerned with, goodness, in order to be concerned with good for someone else, we have to answer two questions. How do we know if something is good? There are two questions. We've iterated many times about this. What are the two questions to ask yourself if you know something is good or not? The first question is, what is it? And the second question is, what is it for? Okay. What is it? What is it for? You can't judge anything as good or bad until you know what it is and what it's for, right? Like I've often given this example of if I just pull out some kind of doohickey and I say, is this good? Well, I don't know. What is it? What is it for? Until I know its purpose, I can't judge it as being good or bad, because good or bad is only relative to some purpose, okay? So good is related to a thing's nature, that is what it is, and its purpose, okay? So the most basic thing in terms of what we owe to each other, what is good, how can I do good for you? If we're talking about a family relationship, then we might naturally owe something to each other. But what if we're talking about someone that you've never met before, they're not a part of your community in any real sense, you don't really owe each other anything, how do we regulate those types of relationships? Well, there may not be a positive debt, something that is actually owed between the two of you. You have really nothing in common. But there could be limits as to say, well, you can't do this to this person, right? There are limits in how we can interact with another person just by virtue of what they are. And what they are, if we're talking about human community, is what? All the people in the world, what do they all have in common? They're all people, right? So by virtue of being a person, by being a human person, there is a built-in limit within the natural law of how we can relate to those people. And so that's why as we move out of the fourth commandment, which is to honor your father and mother, the fifth commandment is that we not kill. Because to do good for someone else, to recognize what is good for you, like what is good for the toaster, well, how do we make it a better toaster? We might have all kinds of things that might make it a better toaster, but the one thing that we can't do, certainly, that will not make it a better toaster, is destroy it. Because existing is the one thing that is a precondition for any other goodness, right? All goodness, all thriving, all flourishing, is built on the first and most basic good, which is simply to be, right? If you don't have being, then you're not going to have any of the other goodness, okay? So in killing, the prohibition against killing is that when a person kills another person, they are removing from that person all possibilities of further goodness or flourishing, right? So that's why an individual never has a right over another person to take their life because it is contrary to their good in the most basic possible way, right? So even if you don't owe someone something, there's a prohibition against killing someone because that removes from them their possibility of good. So Aquinas says this: because in man there is first of all an inclination to good in accordance with the nature which he has in common with all substances. So all substances, if you remember here, a substance is a thing, right? Anything is a substance. So even a rock is a substance. So don't think like chemical substances. Substance is a word Aquinas uses to just mean anything that exists. So a human being, a substance. A rock, a substance. A pool of water, a substance, okay? So all substances have this in common. Every substance seeks the preservation of its own being according to its nature. So everything is, in Aquinas' mind, the way he sees the world, everything is acting towards an end or a purpose. Now it's obvious that animals are acting in a very visible way, right? Because they're eating, they're moving, they're breathing, they're doing things. Why are they doing it? To preserve themselves in being. Everything, Aquinas sees it, has a kind of survival instinct. And he sees that applying even then with inanimate objects. So even like a rock, he sees as having a natural tendency towards self-preservation. A rock is going to try to remain a rock as long as possible, right? So you have to work against it to pulverize it, okay? So every substance has this preservation of being according to its nature. Everything wants to remain the kind of thing that it is. That's nature. And by reason of this inclination, whatever is a means of preserving human life and of warding off its obstacles belongs to the natural law. Okay? So natural law is this principle, that every human person has a right, then, to be preserved in being. Now, where is this controversial? Usually, talking about murder is one of the things that people throw off as a very easy example of, well, we all agree, kind of as Ramsey was saying, well, it's kind of, redundant even to say that murder is wrong, because murder is unlawful killing. So we could talk about areas where this is a little more controversial, and one of them would be abortion, right? But when it comes to abortion, we have to ask ourselves the first question, which is, what is it? Right? What is it? And that's why last time in the series in October, we talked about substance versus accidents. Substance versus accidents. So a substance is what a thing is. What are accidents then? Accidents. In a philosophical, so again, not car accident, but accident in a philosophical sense, as opposed to substance.
You can change
Properties.
Yeah, properties. So things that can change while what it is remains the same. So for instance, right now I'm wearing a tunic, okay? Now the tunic happens to be white. The longer I wear it, the more it becomes gray and brown, okay? But what it is, namely a tunic, it remains, okay? So it can remain being a tunic, even though some of its properties, like its color, might change over time, okay? So we talked before, gave a lot of examples about substantial change versus accidental change, but a substance then is what a thing is. And if we're talking about a human life that has been conceived, it may have very different accidents than you. But let's be honest, we have different accidents from each other, right? We're all different sizes, different shapes, different colors. We all have different abilities. We might have more or less ability. But none of those things make any of us more or less human, right? We are all equally human because we are all the same thing. We differ in our accidents, and even sexual difference is an accident, right? So the fact that we're men and women, okay, still human being is the substance, right? So we're still human beings, and in that sense, we are all perfectly equal, regardless of our ability or anything about those accidents, because those accidents are prone to change, right? So again, human beings naturally, as opposed to other animals or plant life, have eyesight, okay? That's part of human nature. But some human beings, due to accident, due to old age, lose their eyesight. Do they lose their humanity because of that? No, they're not any less human, because eyesight, although it is natural to a human, is accidental, okay, in this philosophical sense. So one doesn't become less human by not having these accidents. So the child, from the moment of conception, is substantially a human being, okay? So the child may be very small. The child may not have any sense perception, may not have feelings, may not have a brain or a heart or anything. I mean, it isn't anything else that you can say. All of those things are accidents to the fact of what it is, essentially, is a living human being, and therefore a person. So not only then is killing directly intending to kill a person a violation of the fifth commandment, but we also have to back up a little bit more and think about these relationships of justice. Because what always strikes me in conversations around abortion is that we all recognize that we live in a society, and by virtue of living in a human community, we owe things to each other, right? So, except for people who are maybe on the most radical extreme of being total individualists and isolationists and I don't owe anything to anyone, we all have a general sense of fairness that we owe things to other members of the community. But as we started with, in the relationship of parent and child, the first and most basic relationship in human society is the relationship between a parent and a child. So if we, as a society, say that a parent owes nothing to the child, then really, I don't think we can make the argument that anybody owes anything to anyone, right? Because if a parent doesn't owe something to their own child, who they have this natural built-in relationship to, then how do I possibly owe anything to someone at the border or in Afghanistan or what? I certainly don't owe anything to anyone out there if I don't owe something to my own child, right? So this is part of why the church sees abortion as such a fundamental issue. It may not strike us, for some of us it strikes us on an emotional level, but for some it might be difficult because a child, especially early in development, again, it doesn't strike us as human because we don't have that, the visuals of crying or pain or the things that we normally associate with human suffering. And so it's easy to maybe have a little bit of distance from it. But again, what we realize is that if this relationship is not sacred, then it's virtually impossible to see any other relationship as having intrinsic value if this one doesn't. Okay? Now we can extend this as well to the elderly, to the sick and the dying. Because again, it's where we think sometimes it's difficult to make these decisions. We think, well, someone is dying, they're in a tremendous amount of pain. It would be better for them if we could, put them to sleep the way we do animals who are suffering or something like that. But why does the church, for instance, say that even in these cases, that we never can directly intend the death of someone, is because that is always contrary to their good. So even if they're suffering, well, we can take whatever means are possible to mitigate suffering, because suffering, again, is contrary to their good. But to intend death is fundamentally different, because now you're cutting that person off from any possible good. Okay? So it is part of the natural law, and therefore the law of the church, that life be considered sacred, right? And when we start taking shortcuts on the areas where it seems harder to uphold that principle, I think it becomes very dangerous, because once that exception has been made of ways that we can take human life into our own hands, the results of that are very dangerous. So that's why not just the teaching of the church, but the natural law says that let's always act in a way towards another person that is preserving their good. And life is the most fundamental good, without which there are no other goods. Okay?
But there's some methods of alleviating pain
Yes.
that do hasten, suppressed breathing and do lead to the outcome that is expected anyway.
Yes. And there's so much more that can be said, but Thomas Aquinas on this issue is incredibly nuanced. And so because you raised this question, let me just say this briefly, that Aquinas acknowledges, and was actually one of the first to develop a really helpful insight, which is what he called the principle of double effect. So what is prohibited is to directly intend the death of an individual. But sometimes there are situations in which, in pursuing a legitimate good, we recognize that there are other consequences that we don't desire, but that will be an outcome, okay? And so, for instance, in delivering to a person medications that will ease their pain, will that also, in some cases, hasten their passing? Perhaps, okay? But Aquinas sees that of the goal of that is not their death. The goal is the alleviation of their suffering, and death, in some instances, might be a foreseen but not a desired consequence. The same thing, by the way, can apply to abortion, because the church's teaching is that there are no exceptions to the prohibition on abortion, but there are situations that are more complicated, where we realize, for instance, let's say that the mother has uterine cancer. Okay, so cancer is being removed, and it's recognized that in removing the cancer, that the fetus, the embryo, will also die. Okay, that Aquinas would understand under the principle of double effect, is that it is not, the death of the child is not the intended outcome. If by some miracle the child survived, all the better, because that wasn't the goal. Okay, so what the church prohibits, whether we're talking about euthanasia or abortion, is any act that directly intends the killing of another person, whether as a means or as an end. Okay, so hopefully that's helpful in bringing a little bit of clarity to that. Okay, are we ready? We have 20 minutes left to talk about sexual ethics. Are we ready? All right. So, what do the spouses then, what do they owe to each other? That then becomes the next sort of logical question, right? Talking about the family, what parents owe to their children, what do we owe to each other? What do spouses owe to each other? So the sixth commandment, of course, is not to commit adultery. So that's why we turn into this commandment. To answer this, I think we have to back up and answer the more basic question of what is marriage? Now, when we're defining anything, as we have talked about before, when we're defining anything, what we're looking for is what we call a specific difference. What makes this thing different from all of the other things in the same category? So, for instance, if I define a cat as an animal with 4 legs, is it true that cats have 4 legs? Yes. Is that a good definition for a cat?
Or is that accidental?
Yeah. But in terms of all things being equal, right? So by nature, a cat will have 4 legs. But the reason why that's not a good definition is because it's overly broad. There are a lot of animals that have 4 legs. So I haven't actually specified anything about a cat. I've given you something that's too generic. Okay. So when we're defining something, we have to say, what is the singular thing that makes this different from something else? So an example we used before is, what is a clock? What is a clock? What's its essential, what's its specific difference? What makes a clock different from everything else? It tells the time. Okay. So if I just say a clock is a round thing, is that a good definition? No, it's not good enough because it's not telling me, well, okay, how is it different from other round things? Right? Okay. So a clock tells time. That's what makes it unique among all the other things that you might hang on the wall. So what is marriage? What is the specific difference of marriage? What makes marriage different than other types of relationships? Because I think a lot of times you ask people, what is marriage? They'll give you a lot of things like an animal with 4 legs, round, you know. They give you a lot of the really generic things that, let's be honest, they apply to all kinds of relationships, right? So you say, what is marriage? Well, marriage is people that love each other. And marriage is people that are committed to each other. And they take care of each other. And they make a commitment. And they're going to be with each other forever. And blah, 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 blah. Okay, so far you have said nothing that is not true of a lot of other relationships, including like religious life, right? So the fact that I have a relationship with several other people where everything that I have belongs to them and they take care of all of my needs, right? But I'm also not married. So all of the things that usually people apply to marriage can apply to all kinds of different relationships between siblings, between family members, within religious life. So what is marriage? What makes marriage different than all these other types of relationships? We don't often want to confront it directly, but marriage is a sexual relationship, okay? So regulating marriage, the reason why society has laws about marriage is not that the state has any concern with who you love, right? You don't have to get a certificate of love for your best friend or something like that. The society doesn't care about your feelings about other people. What it cares about are sexual relationships because those relationships lead to children, and that affects all of us. Okay? So the idea that this is just a purely private matter and that one person's marriage has no effect on anybody else, it's just not true. We live in a society. So think, for instance, when divorce rates are, I'm just making up numbers, but let's say Society A has a divorce rate of 10% and Society B has a divorce rate of 80%. If you remain married in both of those societies, would you really say, well, what everyone else is doing doesn't affect us, doesn't affect my marriage? Well, yeah, actually it does. It affects all of us because those marriages that are splitting up are affecting the next generation, which is affecting all of us. And when everybody else is getting divorced, it puts a strain on our marriage because now we're thinking about, well, we're having a lot of problems too. So we're all connected. And we can't say that, oh, well, what you're doing doesn't affect me. No, it does. And so that's why the state has always had an interest in marriage, because it's a fundamental relationship that builds all of society. Okay, so what is marriage? Marriage is essentially a sexual relationship, okay? So the next question then is, when is sexual activity ethical? In other words, when is it good in a moral sense? So the question then is, how do we know when something is good? What are the questions we have to ask?
What is it?
What is it? What is it for? So what is the specific difference? What makes sexual activity fundamentally different from every other kind of activity? It is the procreative capability, the potential to create new life makes sexual activity different than anything else. It is its specific difference, right? So sexual activity has this natural direction, this natural purpose in generating new life. Now, when we have our science hats on, everybody recognizes that kind of uncontroversially. I mean, that seems to me to be kind of evolutionary biology 101, that society, that species are looking towards their own propagation. And Aquinas sees that very naturally. He says, look, eating is a natural desire because it preserves the individual, right? I have to keep eating in order to preserve myself in being. Sexual activity is another desire that is natural, but rather than preserving the individual, it preserves the species, right? So in order to preserve the species, they have to have a natural drive for sexual activity. It's what keeps the species going. In the same way that if animals never felt hunger, they would just lie out and starve to death, right? So sex and the desire for sex is a natural desire that is ordered towards procreation, okay? So that is what makes it different, and therefore that is its natural end or purpose. Now, this is where the rubber really meets the road, because we've been talking this whole time about what makes a thing good. Is a thing is good when it is ordered towards its purpose, okay? So we kept coming back to the toaster. How can the toaster be a good toaster? And I think everybody was on board with that, and we understood that the toaster couldn't try to be a vacuum cleaner. But then when it comes to this, the brakes really come on, and it gets hard to process for people. That we say, well then, that the same principles apply. That sexual activity is ethical when it is ordered towards its proper and natural function, which is the procreation of children. Now, we can articulate this in, I'm going to give you 3 propositions, so 2 premises and a conclusion, and we'll see what you think. So number 1, a person ought not engage in sexual activity that is contrary to the good of reproduction. So that's the first principle, because that is its natural purpose, and therefore working against that purpose is contrary to the natural good of sexual activity. Yes?
What happens when we're talking about people who are past the age of being
Yes, we'll get to that. Okay. So like past the age of when a person becomes naturally infertile due to age. Okay, we'll come to that. And we have 10 minutes. We might go a little bit over. Is everybody okay with that? We're strapped in. Okay. All right. So a person not to engage in sexual activity that is contrary to the good of reproduction. That's a premise. I haven't proven that to you, but that's premise one. Premise two. Therefore, a person ought not engage in a reproductive act outside of marriage. Right? Therefore, all sexual activity is to be reserved for marriage, right? So, in other words, don't have sex with someone with whom you don't intend to have children, and don't intend to have children with someone with whom you're not married, okay? So Aquinas actually sees the laws regulating sexual activity as concerning, and maybe we'll come to this in a second, but as concerning the rights of children. So we'll come to that in a second. So as to this first claim, Aquinas says, a sin in human acts is that which is against the order of reason. Now, the order of reason consists in its ordering everything to its end in a fitting manner. Everybody, so far so good? That makes sense? Just as the use of food is without sin, if it be taken in due manner and order, as required for the welfare of the body, so also sexual acts are without sin, provided they are done in due manner and order, in keeping with the end of human procreation. So the analogy with food is a really helpful one, because why do we eat? Well, at the most fundamental level, we eat, again, as Aquinas says, for self-preservation, right? We need to eat in order to survive. Now, do we also enjoy eating? Yeah, right? So there are other goods attached to eating beyond just self-preservation. We don't eat just to survive. So there are other goods attached to it. But our eating can become sinful when we eat in such a way that is out of order, not respecting the proper manner of the health of the body, and when we try, for instance, to radically separate the pleasure of eating from the natural good of eating, which is caloric intake, right? So the kind of analogy here would be, the ancient, the Roman custom of binging and purging, that you can eat more and enjoy feasting if you then, make yourself vomit, and then you come back and you can eat more. Okay, so that Aquinas would see as being contrary to nature, because you have, yes, eating food is good as required for the welfare of the body, and that's not to say that you can't enjoy food or eat food that is enjoyable, but you also have to remember what is the intrinsic good of food and not violate those principles. So eating in excess, eating in deficiency, these would be ways in which we can misuse food. By the same token, then, to respect the nature of sexual activity is to respect its natural purpose. And when we intervene to separate sexual activity from its natural purpose, we create other sorts of ripple effects, as we'll see. So that's why we cannot act contrary to the nature of a thing and preserve its good, because it is, by definition, contrary to its good. Okay, the second, he says, unlike in some other animals, the upbringing of a human child requires not only the mother's care and nourishment, but the care of his father as guide and guardian. Hence, human nature rebels against an indeterminate union of the sexes and demands that a man should be united to a determinate woman and should abide with her even for a whole lifetime. This union is called matrimony, which for the above reason is said to belong to the natural law. Does that make sense, right? So unlike other animals where they're born, running around, they can take care of themselves, who is reproducing with whom in some species really makes no difference. But because of our human nature and the need that a child has for father and mother, it is contrary to the human good for people to be partnering up all over the place, because now we don't have that solid, stable foundation where a father and mother are together able to raise a child. Okay? So that's why he sees marriage as a natural institution. So marriage is part of the natural law, the laws that govern marriage. So therefore, this relationship what Aquinas is getting at is that it is actually the right of the child, and a lot of what he has to say about adultery involves the violation of the rights of the child. The right of the child to know his or her parents, to be raised by them, and the right of the spouses to fidelity. Okay, but in committing adultery, in this, what Aquinas is calling this indeterminate union, it really is, as we're saying before, well, who do these things harm? Well, first and foremost, they harm the next generation. They harm children who are deprived of their right, their natural right, which is to know and to be educated by their parents. Now, obviously, in some cases, that is not possible, and so we have adoption, we have these other things to remediate places where those systems break down. But it remains a child's natural right to know and to be raised by his or her parents. So Pope Paul VI in Humanae Vitae, I'll send this document, so afterwards I send a link to these videos, the slides, and some other supplemental material. Humanae Vitae is a very short document, but a really brilliant one, where the Church was reckoning with this teaching, because the Church obviously has always taught that sexual activity, that we cannot act contrary to the procreative end. But with modern technology, particularly the pill, it became a little ambiguous of, well, it seems like the infertility is sort of separated, right? It muddied the water for some people, and they thought, well, maybe this might be an ethical way to practice contraception. So the Church deliberated on this, and I think Pope Paul VI, in this statement of Humanae Vitae, came to a very insightful decision of applying the natural law in the modern context. So he says, we base our words on the first principles of a human and Christian doctrine. So first of all, he's saying that this is natural law. It's not anything that's arbitrary in terms of church teaching. This is the natural law as it is applied in a modern context. When we are obliged once more to declare, condemned by the magisterium of the Church, any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation. So that is a very helpful, simple way of defining what it is that the Church is prohibiting. So the question naturally comes, what about infertile couples? Forgive me a very crude analogy with baseball. So imagine I was on a Major League Baseball team. I would put it to you that it would be very, very unlikely, I would be willing to say impossible, that I would ever score a run. Okay? You put me on a Major League Baseball team, I will never score a run. Now, what is the purpose of baseball? What's the goal of the game? The goal of the game is to score runs. So that's what I'm out there trying to do. And even if I never do it, even if I recognize that it's impossible, right? I'm never going to hit a home run, and I'm never going to dunk a basketball. I cannot do those things. Nevertheless, it doesn't prevent me from playing the game. Okay? Now, what would be different would be to say, okay, well, because I realize that I'm never going to score a run, well, then I'll just put on a helmet and shoulder pads and just go tackle the first baseman because, well, I wasn't going to score anyways. No, see, because there are still the rules of the game. And so just because someone by nature or ability cannot accomplish the natural intended function is totally, fundamentally different than someone who intends to prevent the goal from occurring. So look again at what Pope Paul is saying here. It is any action which either before, at the moment of, or after sexual intercourse is specifically intended to prevent procreation. So couples that are naturally infertile don't fall into this in any way, because what is prevented is, or what is prohibited are actions that are intended to upset or to disrupt the nature of the act. Okay, So it really makes it fundamentally different. But I know that is a very frequent concern. But lastly, then, he has this to say that I think kind of, to me, it's this, and I encourage you to read the whole document, really makes this practical. He says, we base our words, we read that. Consider how easily this course of action could open wide. So he's saying the acceptance of contraception, which, by the way, if you realize, some of you who are older take this for granted, but I think it's shocking to young people to realize that in the mid-20th century, that contraception was understood to be not legal for production and sale, because there was a universal acknowledgement that this is contrary to the good of society. So how much we've changed within a generation is hard sometimes to realize. But right here in 68, Paul, I think prophetically, is saying, consider how easily this course of action could open wide the way for marital infidelity and a general lowering of moral standards. A man who grows accustomed to the use of contraceptive methods may forget the reverence due to a woman, and disregarding her physical and emotional equilibrium, reduce her to being a mere instrument for the satisfaction of his own desires, no longer considering her as his partner, whom he should surround with care and affection. Now, Pope John Paul II, I'll conclude with this. I recommend this book to you as well, Love and Responsibility. He actually wrote this book prior to being elected Pope, so that's why it's under his birth name, Karol Wojtyła. But this is an excellent treatment of understanding the Church's teaching on sexual morality and that relationship between love and responsibility, and really highlights what Pope Paul is getting at here, which is that the way John Paul describes it is that in the sexual act, the idea is, because sometimes people see this, they balk at this way of thinking because it seems crude. It seems that it's not understanding the real dynamic of a married couple who love each other and who are expressing love to each other. But John Paul really gets this and says that, what is at the core of the sexual act is a giving of one's whole self to another person. That it is this gift of self that we really see in marriage, and that the reason why contraception is so dangerous and problematic is because it's a way of kind of lying, as he describes it. So the act itself is saying, I give myself wholly to you. But contraception is saying, but not this. Or maybe the other way around, to say, I accept all of you, but not that. It's taking the fertility of a human person, which is part of their totality, and saying, I don't want that part of you or this part of me to be part of this exchange. So it actually undermines that relationship at its most fundamental level of the total gift of oneself, and introduces these artificial obstructions and barriers that prevent the expression of the full expression of love between spouses. So where have we been? Okay, so first table, thought, word, and deed. Thought, word, and deed. Deed, word, and thought. So next week, as we conclude, we will be talking about stealing, which you probably think, oh, I've never stolen anything. Not if you read Thomas Aquinas. So I promise you this will be interesting. We'll talk about stealing and lying, which, okay, we might be guilty of that too. And we may, if time permits next week, to tie all these things in, to talk in general about some big picture things of, okay, so this is the natural law, this is what God is saying, the church is saying, reason is saying, but how does this relate to our human laws, to politics, to the society that we live in? So we may, if time permits, apply some of those things. I'm happy to stop and continue to take questions afterwards, but just for the sake of time, we'll close it here. So thank you, and we will see you next week.
May I